7. Rebukes and Excommunication. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 1 to 16, St. Paul discusses the rebuke of church members. Elders are to be first entreated as a father. Younger men are to be rebuked as brethren. The elder women as mothers, the younger as sisters. Widows, men and women, the idle and busybodies are all mentioned by St. Paul in his declaration of the rebuke. The rebuke is the first stage in chastisement and is referenced to Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. It has reference to a known and obvious offence which is brought to the attention of the offender by a pastor or member in the light of Scripture. It can also be the last step in some matters which call for a public rebuke. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 20. In this epistle, St. Paul is plainly concerned with the law. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 3 to 11. The areas of concern for rebuke, chastisement, and excommunication are then cited in terms of church problems. They are essentially matters of faith and morals, of authority and law. The goal of such actions is not the church, but God's kingdom, not an institution, but God's reign. Some, although by no means all of the areas cited by St. Paul are, first, authority. Men must assume the leadership in matters of the faith, as well as in the home, and women must not step outside the bounds of their position. 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 8 to 15. St. Paul, from this statement of authority, goes on to deal with the authority, in terms of qualifications, of a bishop or presbyter. Authority is given only to men who can exercise authority, and whose ability at disciplining themselves and their households is a proven one. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 to 13. Second, areas of doctrine and false teaching concerning doctrine and morality are discussed. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 to 16. Asceticism and sacerdotal celibacy are condemned. We have here no new law, but the biblical law as a whole, and biblical faith as a whole, affirmed. No new dispensation has rendered the Old Testament view of meats and marriage obsolete. Third, areas of morality are cited as areas for rebuke. It is the obligation of parents to teach their children godliness. Let us examine specifically what St. Paul says. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 3, he commands, "Honour widows that are widows indeed." Moffat accurately paraphrases this as, "Widows in real need must be supported from the fund." The meaning of honouring father and mother clearly involves support. The widows excluded from church support are, as Lenski summarized it, such as have relatives and such as plunge into a gay life. Worthy widows, in return for their support, work for the church. Widows with families are then cited. These have a teaching function, as does the church, in relation to their children and grandchildren. When a widow has children or grandchildren, they, the children and grandchildren, must learn that the first duty of religion is to their own household, and that they should make some return to those who have brought them up. In God's sight, this is commendable indeed. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4. Moffat. Failure to care for members of one's family thus constitutes a violation of the fifth commandment. It is also a violation of the eighth, in that it is a form of theft. This same point, the duty of providing for one's family, is restated in verse 8. Whoever does not provide for his own relatives, and particularly for his own family, has repudiated the faith. He is worse than an infidel. Moffat. Lenski's comment on this verse is very much to the point. This is stated in the strongest form. In verse 4 it is, "Let them learn." Here the sense is, if one will not learn, this is a verdict to be pronounced on him. But in verse 4 we have the case of only one widow. Here it is a question of any and all dependents. The reference to anyone is perfectly plain. It is a person who has a household, whose business is to provide for the members of this household. The verb means to think beforehand, and thus intensified to carry out this thinking, that is, to provide. Paul states it in the most comprehensive way. Provide for his own, and especially his family members. The preferred reading has only one article, for Paul does not refer to two distinct groups. His own are all who belong to the head of the house, servants and members of the family. Here is a strong argument regarding the support of a widowed mother or grandmother. One ought to provide for even his servants. How much more then for one's own mother or grandmother? But all dependents are included, father and mother. If these are dependents, wife and children, also other relatives such as orphans, nephews and nieces. This is the Christian teaching. Now, he who will not live up to that, the faith he denies, etc. In order to make plain the enormity of such an action, Paul adds in an explicative way, and is worse than an unbeliever, one who has never believed and never professed to believe. The thought is not that an unbeliever would always provide for the members of his family and his servants. Many do not. But when an unbeliever does not do so, bad as he is, bad as his action is, it is not as bad as having the true teaching and then flagrantly denying it. What the congregation should do with a member of this kind does not need to be added. His verdict is written here. Those who do not support their own are first to be rebuked, and then excommunicated. Where false doctrine is involved, we are required to avoid such persons. Romans chapter 16, verse 17. Indeed, to reject them after the first and second admonition. We are not to receive such persons into our house, nor to bid them Godspeed. To do so makes us partaker of their evil deeds. 2 John, verses 10 and 11. Where immorality such as non-support is involved, such men are also to be rejected. The same is true of unrepentant fornicators who are church members. They are to be excommunicated. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 9 to 11. Just as honour means more than verbal respect and includes support, so requite and provide mean more than merely financial support. To provide for one's children includes a Christian education. For the child's mind and body must both be provided for. Placing children in a public school or in an atheistic school is a failure to provide for them adequately. It should be noted that the Apostolic Church, and for centuries later the Christian Church, provided for widows, orphans, and the sick, for all needy persons, as a part of its duty. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 10, reference is made to lodging strangers, and elsewhere to hospitality. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. In those days, outside of Palestine, inns were usually houses of prostitution as well, and hence no place for Christians to stay. As a result, the duty of caring for travelling Christians was an important one. The early church was thus a very extensive government, and it continued to be so almost to the 20th century. It is important to restate here the meaning of government in its historic biblical sense. The basic government of man is the self-government of Christian man. Family is an important area of government also, and the basic one. The church is an area of government, and the school still another. A man's calling is an area of government, and society at large governs men by its standards and opinions. The state is thus one government among many. It is civil government, and it cannot be permitted to usurp or claim areas which do not belong to it. Because of the biblical understanding of government, many law spheres exist, and each has its inner authority, discipline, and requirements. These spheres are separate but interlocking. The state, thus, must require children to support their parents, but the church, whether or not the state acts, has a duty to teach and to chastise or to excommunicate its members in this same matter. Similarly, the family is required to teach such support. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 4, and to deal with its erring members for failure to obey. Another area of morality cited by St. Paul is with respect to wages. The principle, previously considered in relation to Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, "Thou shalt not muzzle the ox when he treadeth out the corn," is that the labourer is worthy of his reward. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 18. Economic considerations are not set aside by this requirement, but rather reinforced. The wise man is a good steward not only of money and materials, but also of men. The man who pays his workers as little as possible is ultimately the loser before God. It is clear, thus, that the punishment inflicted by the Church has primary reference to man's behaviour before God and man. The reduction of much church chastisement to offences against the Church is a perversion of Scripture and a limitation of the Church's jurisdiction.